think it's a lump.
All right, how's everybody today? Good. So
Already put down a piece of cake.
I said, I think in the last class meeting, we were talking about the fact that internal marketing is equally as important as external marketing, because we have recognized in business that if we can get employees to engage in what we call living the brand, your profitability and your company's brand equity are likely to increase, because the experiences that customers have with all of those touch points is going to be greater. So how do we ensure sort of fairness in, and how do we get employees to live the brand? Well, one way we can do it is to, let's go to the right, let's see if this will come up. Focus on how do we engage in ethical treatment of people in the workplace, and then what can we expect from them in return? So moral rights in the workplace. What are they? Why are they beneficial? And how can we expect employees to respond and engage in living the brand, and what kind of responsibilities should we expect from them? This is not an area without controversy, because as I intimated before, when I talked about the idea of employee rights and the idea and concept of living the brand and marketing to our employees, during the 80s, it was pretty fashionable to say, look, we got all these old employees hanging around here, and they're sick and they're demanding and they've got kids and they want all these things. We can hire somebody who's young and right out of college and will work 80 hours a week at half or 3/4 the cost. And if you think that that's, the end of the story, just being able to hire somebody for less, it's also going to affect things like our insurance policy and our ability to provide health insurance for other employees, because generally speaking, younger employees have fewer health issues, and we're not going to have the same level of risk, and thus our premiums are likely to go down. One of the things that's happening at UCO, and one of the reasons that we have a lot of costs, is that this is the one profession where age is a distinct advantage. It just takes a long time to get a PhD. And then once you get it, you become better in most disciplines, with the exception of things like math and physics. If you are going to be a fantastic mathematician or physicist, you're going to do that in your 20s. I was going to say 1920s. You're going to do it in your 20s because your brain works a lot faster as you get older. But most every other discipline, knowledge is cumulative. I can tell you that although I don't relate to my students as much as I did when I started out, I was 22 years old when I started teaching here. I don't relate as well to my students, and they don't seem to get my jokes as much as they used to in the past. I know a lot more. I've just had a lot more experience. I've gone out in the corporate world. I've done these things. When I was 22, I didn't have a lot of experience. At 50, I've gone out and had all of these things that I can bring into the classroom that add to that wealth of knowledge. But in a lot of work environments, age is not necessarily a good thing. College professor is not a terribly taxing job. It's not even like, I think teachers have a pretty good job, but they have to stand up and teach for 6 hours a day? They have a planning period. I mean, you're stuck in a room. If you're an elementary school teacher, you're stuck in a room with these kids from 8:30 in the morning until 3:30 in the afternoon, and you gotta perform constantly. I perform for 75 minutes twice a week. I'm doing other stuff for my job in addition to that, but the amount of time I have to be on stage is 75 minutes twice a week. So this is the one area where we have a lot of advantages to being older, but that comes with costs, right? As a result of the fact that the faculty tend to be 40 plus, means that you have a lot of health issues with that. And that means that our cost of providing insurance to employees is a lot more than it is at some place like Chesapeake. I've had lots of friends and a spouse that worked at Chesapeake, and it's a young culture. And they have a culture of you don't take the elevator when Aubrey McClendon was there because, they wanted to keep everybody healthy. And one way to get your steps in is, build these multi-story buildings and expect everybody to walk up and down the stairs. And that was, they put elevators in because the law says you have to have them, but nobody used them. So what are the moral rights in the workplace that we can expect, and what responsibilities can we expect in return from employees? So let's talk about some discussion cases. In a previous edition of the book, which is sort of interesting, I don't know if the current edition has this because I didn't look at the current edition, because I think these are actually better stories. They gave a bunch of different, in this chapter, a bunch of different examples. So there was a salesman, which I like because I teach professional sales. A salesman is fired after he was able to secure a major account. He was fired by his manager, who then gets, this one is not that interesting, who then gets his commission. Because the contract, the employment contract said you had to stay through the end of the quarter in order to get your commission on that. So he gets a big contract. So I think that one's pretty easy. I think most of us would say that clearly doesn't sound ethical. Unless, of course, he did something to secure the contract that was, highly irregular. What about this one? This one actually was a real case. This one is harder. The second one is harder. There was an insurance company, a health insurance company, that decided that they were going to mandate that their employees had to stop smoking. They gave them 6 months to stop smoking. If you didn't stop smoking, you were fired. And the way they determined whether or not you stopped smoking was they started doing tests for nicotine, urine analysis of nicotine. What about that one?
That doesn't seem right.
Why not?
You can make them not smoke on the premise, but if they want to go smoke something that's legal at home, that's their right to do so.
Also, what if they use like a nicotine patch? What if they're so addicted that it hinders their everyday lives for not smoking? Because I know you can have like withdrawal symptoms.
You have the big duck.
But
All right. It's legal, but your behavior impacts others. That was the company's argument. If you smoke, our insurance rates go up. UCO does this now. If you're a smoker, we don't test, but you have to check. And if you're a smoker, you pay higher premiums than non-smokers.
That's understandable.
Okay, so charge them more for their premiums.
Yeah, there could have been another way to go about it, because if they're employees, they could have been like you get 10% less of your paycheck if you're going to keep smoking or something like that.
Okay, so you could do it, you could incentivize them financially rather than just firing them. The employer who did this said, look, we're a health insurance company. We should be promoting good health. Smoking is not healthy. It may be legal. Marijuana is now legal. They still test for it in a lot of drug places. And if you test positive, well, I say it's legal. It's the federal government will tell you it's not legal, right? And they could come and arrest you at any moment. They've chosen not to enforce certain provisions unless they think you're what's called a kingpin and you're engaged in, in places like Oklahoma and Colorado, they've chosen not to enforce the marijuana thing. But in theory, it's a federal crime. Now, whether or not it should be, I don't know. I think it's kind of stupid at this point. I think it's sort of ridiculous when I think now over a majority of the states have some form of legalization of marijuana, but nicotine, you're doing, and the company's argument is like your bad habit is affecting other people because our own insurance rates go up, and we need to get rid of you. They gave them 6 months to do it. If they didn't do it, they were out. Now I will tell you, they got even more aggressive with this. This company decided that they were going to mandate that your spouse couldn't smoke either.
Wow. Where did we draw the line?
I mean, if your spouse smokes, nicotine is gonna show up, and that's what a lot of people said. I quit smoking, but my spouse still smoked. I got secondhand smoke and it showed up. And how do you prove that? And they said, well, your spouse had better quit. In essence.
Well, if you're tested for drugs and they show up, you can't just say, oh, I was around people who were doing, I mean, I feel like that's the same concept. You can't just say, oh, it was secondhand.
I feel like this company is really reaching with that.
I feel like
Like you're, like I totally get that part. That's totally right, but also like controlling their families, their spouses. What if they go out to a friend's house and they smoke around them?
What if your kid smokes?
but they know that they're gonna be tested for it, so
Yes.
don't be around it.
I took an HR class and it was kind of interesting because like if like you test positive for it, like the employer can't say that you're positive, they just say like non-negative, and then they like have to like send it to wherever and like see like the number that like,
The level?
yeah, like the level that you're at to like say if it's like within whatever range. It's like not good.
I mean, one of the things that happens with drug testing that I've been told, I don't know for sure, I've never done this because I don't like poppy seed muffins. But if you eat poppy seeds are what they use to make a lot of barbiturates, and so you will test positive
Oh.
for drugs if you eat poppy seed muffins.
For opium.
For opium.
Like heroin.
So,
That was like one of the things that was said that like you would test positive, but it wouldn't be high enough that like it wouldn't like scale high enough that it would be like, oh yeah, like that was, I don't know what drug it like.
we're gonna start, you know, I mean, there are lots of drugs you could take that will cause a false positive on the drug test.
Right.
If you take certain antihistamines, that can cause false positives on the drug test for things that are perfectly legal. What about firing an employee for considering an abortion?
That's their right still.
Maybe not,
It's just a law.
after this term of the Supreme Court, it may no longer be your right.
To this current time.
But the action didn't happen. It says considering.
Considering.
I could consider like, I don't wanna say like murdering somebody, but like
So,
if somebody pissed me off and I was
If
like.
you don't go through
Can't
with
fire
it,
you for it. I don't know what you're there.
I don't know, that's again, it's perfectly legal. What if you're Hobby Lobby?
I mean, it
Who's
would
adamantly
probably be how
opposed.
open they are about considering it. Like if you were like Hobby Lobby or even like Chick-fil-A, some of the big Christian-owned companies who are against abortion, you're super open about it and also showing that you are an employee of that establishment, I feel like it would technically be within the establishment's right to fire you for going against their ethics or
Their
their
moral code?
Yeah.
I will tell you that in this case, it was not a company that was was in any way, shape, or form sort of ethically opposed to abortion by the nature of their business, where you could say that with Hobby Lobby. They just said that it created a issue in the workplace because she discussed it with her coworkers and her coworkers became upset, and it then became them. Well, I would say fire the I mean, my personal opinion is she didn't start the problem, they did, fire them. That would be my personal, solution. It's like, she's not the problem. Although I guess bringing your personal, like maybe you shouldn't bring your personal stuff to work. Like, don't be talking about, but that's not realistic, is it? I mean, people are human beings. We generally share more than we probably should. In the early era of HIV, they would deny health insurance. They could. Now, we've had laws that prevent people from doing this, and this is no longer a big deal. I can remember when this was a very big deal. When if you tested positive for HIV, you did not want anybody to know because it meant you were probably going to be fired because people were scared. But still, HIV positive employees, again, that's a condition that creates more cost for employers should they be able to deny benefits to those people. Well, my general attitude is that's the purpose of insurance. And the purpose of insurance is to spread risk, right? And if you're denying people, I mean, you're not really doing, you're picking and choosing. That's not insurance. Insurance is about spreading risk. This one, monitoring, I think all of us expect this anymore now, but in the early ages of email, employers monitoring employees' email. I think all of us know that they can monitor your email.
That still happens.
If you log on to D2L now, it says you have no expectation of privacy in this platform, right? I think we all recognize that employers are gonna do that. What about pre-employment psychological testing?
Like, that's a good thing.
What do they, I mean, it's like
You
what
got
they
some
test
serious
it.
issue, like what if they test my freaking out for like the FBI or the CIA, and they might have.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah,
You have to.
they absolutely test, I can tell you that.
Technically, most jobs, especially nowadays, you're dealing with money too.
Right.
So if you have psychological issues that
Could
could involve you like stealing or something, obviously they're not going to want.
Everybody in this age has a psychological issue.
Yes.
If we went through the DSM-5, I read a study the other day and they said that something like 1 in 5 Oklahomans suffers from a major psychological issue.
What counts as major?
Well, that's a good question. So let's go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's 1.
All right, which
One,
one's
two,
one? We're
two,
talking about four.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3. We've got at least 3.5 in here that probably have, I don't know. What constitutes that? I think we sort of understand that, I guess, if you're going, as you suggested, for the FBI or the CIA. When I was a young professor, I applied for a job and they did a psychological screening. They did a very, 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 very unpsychological and unscientific version. They gave me the Myers-Briggs. How many of you have taken the Myers-Briggs? Myers-Briggs it's not scientific. There's nothing scientific about it. It's not the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Denying positions to females that may be detrimental to pregnancy. They used to do this a lot. There used to be a plant in Oklahoma owned by Kerr McGee that manufactured, it was right north of here in Logan County in a little town called Crescent. It was the Kerr McGee nuclear facility. And if you were planning on having kids, they generally said, we're not going to hire you to be a tech in certain areas of the building because it could affect pregnancy. If there's a movie that came out about this, the plant is now closed. You can still see where the plant was. It's up. If you go on Portland all the way up to Crescent, Crescent's kind of a creepy little town. I used to be vice mayor in Guthrie, and you'd meet people and they'd say they were from Guthrie. And I'm like, I literally campaigned all over the city. My mother was vice mayor before me. I don't know you. And they'd find out they were from Crescent. They didn't want to admit they were from Crescent because it's like this, it's a creepy little town. And anyway, they had this nuclear plant up there, the Kerr McGee facility. And there was a movie that came out. They started stealing nuclear material to prove, this one employee, her name was Karen Silkwood, to prove that they were not handling the material in the correct way and that they were being irresponsible. So you can watch it. It stars Meryl Streep as Karen Silkwood and her best friend, who they call Dolly, whose name was something different in real life. Her real name in life was Sherry Ellis, and my law partner was actually Sherry's attorney. Is played by Sharon. So what about that? What if they say, I'm not gonna have children?
I think, if they're not gonna have children, it's kind of hard to know if in the future that change.
Yeah, I mean, like, things change, right? Lots of people,
But I think that's something that you can put in the contract that, like, if they become pregnant, they are due to not being fired but being let out because of medical reasons or.
I where does our paternalism end? This one is not terribly interesting. All of these are interesting because there are arguments on both sides. Do you want to be responsible for bringing a child into the world that could have major health or physical limitations as a result of something that your company did? That's a tough case, right? That's what makes ethics interesting. It's not the easy cases. It's not the Enrons. Enron's not a terribly interesting case because it's so obvious that they shouldn't have done this. But can we engage in psychological? The reason that they did, and I asked them about this at this job that I applied for when I was, again, a young professor, and I applied for this job. I applied for lots of jobs. And they said, well, we want to make sure you're going to be a good fit with us, that your personality is going to jive with us. And I'm like, is that really what we should be encouraging in higher ed? Personalities that jive. I mean, like, one of the things that we should have in higher education institutions is what? A wide range and diversity of opinion and ideas. That's how we know that ideas that are the best rise. I mean, at least in theory, this is what we say the First Amendment does, is the active debate ensures that the best ideas will rise to the surface. So work is controlled by others. A big portion of our life is going to be controlled by others, which means that there are lots of ethical implications in the workforce. There are sort of three types of rights that we can talk about. We can talk about legal rights. So the Fair Labor Standards Act, which says that you have a minimum wage. Now, whether or not that minimum wage is adequate is up for debate, and lots of people are saying it's not. Although, in essence, the de facto minimum wage has been raised because employees, as a result of COVID and several other things, have gotten a better hand on their negotiating power. So lots of people are demanding $15 an hour. So we have legal rights, the Fair Labor Standards Right, the Occupational Safety and Health Act, the Family Medical Leave Act, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act. Things like that are all legal rights that we have. Some of these have moral import, some of them don't. I don't know that there's a great deal of moral import with regard to minimum wage, although maybe there is. Walmart has historically paid very low wages, and as a result, their employees are eligible for, in many instances, Medicaid. What does that mean? It means that we, as the population, are subsidizing the medical costs of Walmart employees who historically they can't do this anymore as a result of what's called Obamacare. But before Obamacare, what Walmart did is they kept almost all of their employees as part-time. And so they didn't have to offer you benefits under the part-time employment. They only promoted to full-time a select number of people. Most people were part-time. They didn't offer them benefits. Those people that were part-time because they were paid so little were eligible for Medicaid, which means who's paying for it ultimately?
Everybody else.
The taxpayer, right? The sad thing in this country is that in the United States, it's not the poor who lack health care and it's not the rich. You want to know who lacks health care in this country? It's the middle class. It's sole proprietorships. It's small entrepreneurs who can't afford the health insurance. Then we can have contractual rights. Generally speaking, in America, employers don't offer employment contracts, and we operate on an employment at will basis, but certain employees do have contractual rights. I, for example, have contractual rights. I am a tenured professor, so I have a continued expectation of employment. That's a contractual right. And then we can talk about moral rights. These are not necessarily mutually exclusive categories. They often overlap, right? So I would say occupational health and safety, obviously we should have work conditions that are safe. Prior to the act being enacted, during the Industrial Revolution, employers, oftentimes had very dangerous working conditions. People lost fingers and limbs and things like that, and they didn't have any recourse against their employer. It was just, oops, so sorry, sucks to be you. Here's your day's wages. Thanks, get out. So that obviously has moral import, but it also has legal import. What we're going to focus on are mostly those that overlap and have moral import. So right to work, this sounds good in terms of right to work laws. We have a right to work law in Oklahoma. What does that mean? It means you don't have to be forced to join a union. You cannot be made to even pay for the portion of your salary that the union contributed to in terms of collective bargaining. So we have lots of right to work laws. These actually have a lot of moral issues in that they have free rider issues, and this is why the unions hate them. Because the union bargains on behalf of all of the employees, and all of these employees get the advantage of that bargain, but they don't have to pay the cost, right? How do you overcome the free rider problem? Lots of organizations have free rider problems. For example, the AARP, the American Association of Retired Persons, is going to lobby on behalf of all older people for things like Medicare expansion and Social Security protection and healthcare for elderly people, right? They're gonna do that. How do they overcome the free rider problem? So older people have no incentive necessarily to join AARP, knowing that AARP is going to negotiate on their behalf or lobby on their behalf with the government. So what do? Well, they do certain things like they get discounts. If you are an AARP member with hotels and travel and airlines and things like that, they offer private goods to get people to join AARP so that they can continue their mission of focusing on things like, you know, increasing the benefits of Medicare so that you get things like, historically, Medicare did not cover things like hearing aids. That was considered sort of a luxury item. Medicare just covered basic healthcare costs. One of the things that we recognize now is that hearing aids actually affect the overall health of individuals. If you have hearing loss and you do not address it, you are far more likely to suffer from dementia. I mean, there are all these other things so they've argued and they've expanded the programs to include these kinds of benefits that you're eligible for under Medicare. We can also talk of right to work in terms of the right to job, to have a job. Who should provide that? This is sort of a Catholic social philosophy. The current Pope, for example, the current Holy Father, says that we have an ethical obligation, particularly in the developed world, to ensure that people have, you know, sustainable living conditions. The UN Declaration of Human Rights also has similar sorts of statements. If we say that everybody has a right to a job, who should provide that job? Should it be the government or should we encourage the private sector? A lot of students, particularly in the United States, say we should have no expectation of the private sector. Well, the private sector actually gets a great benefit from the state, right? The sovereign defines the law, and what the sovereign grants, the sovereign can take away. Corporate status is something that is allowed by the sovereign, and it confers a great deal of protection to individuals. Why do we have corporations? Corporations allow for limited liability, meaning that the owners of the corporation are only liable for the amount of money that they invest in the corporation. Now, what that means, in essence, is that corporations can hurt people and their owners are not personally liable for that hurt. This happened in the 1970s with an automobile, for example, called the Pinto that Ford developed. What Ford wanted to do is they wanted to manufacture a vehicle that was enormously cheap, a very cheap vehicle. I think it was supposed to be under like $2,000 or something like that. If you go back in time, by the way, the average car in the 1980s was something like, I think, $10,000. The average car price today is over $50,000, right? The average new car price. That's now you can get cheap cars. There's no doubt that you can still get cars. I don't know that you can get any new car for under 10 anymore. But you can still get cars that are less than $50,000. But they're expensive. all of the urban assault vehicles that all of the shallow and pretentious people who live in Edmond drive, are close to $100,000. I have a visceral dislike of Edmond. I graduated from Guthrie High School, like Edmond is there's just this rivalry between Guthrie and Edmond, so. So Ford manufactures this vehicle called the Pinto. One of the ways they manufacture it so cheaply is there's a design that, because where they have to place the gas tank, if you were hit in the rear and the bumper, the car had a pretty good chance of exploding and blowing up. Like, boom, gone. And Ford knew this. And they calculated the actuarial cost of keeping the car in production and on the road and paying off families who experienced death was less than the profitability of the car. It's going to cost more to recall all the Fords and deal with the problem than it was to just leave it out there. Because who bought the Ford Pinto? Well, overwhelmingly, there were some people who were just inherently cheap who buy, we all have friends like this. I have a tendency, because I don't have children, to buy cars that I want. I love all things that go, right? I've had lots of boats and cars and airplanes and all of these things that go, and I love them all. The only thing that I've had that I didn't really love that went was a motorcycle. I really thought I would love owning a motorcycle, and it was just boring to me. It was not fun. So love things that go. So I have a tendency to buy cars that are expensive, but I have friends. I have a friend who he and his spouse make well over $250,000 a year, each of them. And they drive an old Ford Ranger, and they buy, the last car they bought was a used Hyundai something. I don't know, that they got for less than $10,000. And they can clearly afford, but most people, if they can afford better cars than that, buy better. They're the exception to the rule. So Ford calculated the average buyer of the Pinto was someone who was not wealthy, and thus was not going to cost much. This is the science that we will determine the value of a human life. And they figured that those people, it was easier to just pay them off, their families off, than it was to fix the problem. Most of us think that that's probably a, sort of bankrupt moral position to take. And the reason they could do that is because of the corporate form. Ford investors were not going to be personally liable for the results of their actions. So we give you this enormous benefit. Shouldn't we be able to say that as a result of this enormous benefit, you have some societal responsibility? And in fact, your generation is one that is demanding more and more accountability. And so we see corporations engaging in social entrepreneurship, things like Tom's, the 1-for-1 and Bombas, who are focused on environmentally sustainable models of production and also good social responsibility. We can also talk about the right to continued employment. Once you've got the job, what should be your expectations in terms of keeping that job? Again, employment at will would say we could fire you at any time for any reason or no reason at all. But should you have a right to continued employment, an expectation of continued employment? Most of us who teach moral philosophy think that, yeah, you should. That again, corporations receive huge benefits, therefore they should be expected to have some social responsibility. So employment at will is this concept. It's a laissez-faire legal economic doctrine that says, look, I can quit this job at any time. My employer should be able to fire me at any time. Well, there are certain restrictions even on employment at will, things like civil rights. In 1965, 1955, I'm sorry, 1955, we got Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. In 1965, we got the Civil Rights Act, which started eliminating the ability to have absolute control by employers over firing people. Before 1965, employers could say, we're not hiring anybody who is African American, we're not hiring anybody who's Hispanic, or we're not, hiring anybody who's Irish or anything like that. So there are even limits there. So we start in 1965 with the Civil Rights Act. Then the unions, of course, have expanded a lot of those rights and have eaten away at employment at will. And then we also say there are certain public policies. You can't fire people for things that are going to violate public policy. So for example, whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are generally not looked at fondly by their organizations, but we've started to say things like, the people who worked at Enron, the accountants who came forward and said, this is what's happening, and these are the things that could happen, the bad consequences that could happen. Of course, that ended up happening with Enron. They went broke, and lots of people lost all of their money that they had invested in their 401ks through the Enron stock program. That you can't fire those people. So there are limits even to employment at will, even in the most extreme forms. Due process in the workplace. So there are two types of due process. There's what we call procedural due process, and there's substantive due process. Substantive due process generally refers to things that involve government actions and limitations on the sovereign's ability to interfere in your life. When we think of employment situations, we generally are talking about procedural due process. So what kinds of rights would you want? So let's take an example. You all are students here at the University of Central Oklahoma, right? So let's suppose, as your professor, you turned in, or you're going to turn in shortly, a paper on an article that you are supposed to review that involves some marketing and ethical issue combined, right? And you're going to provide an analysis and make an argument. And the reason I assign this exercise is because I want you to get experience coming up with more than short arguments. What we do in class involves sort of making short arguments back and forth. I want you to take that and expand on it and be able to come up with longer arguments, because when you go into the workplace, your boss is going to give you a problem and you're going to have to make an argument as to why your solution to that problem is the best solution. And they're going to push back on you and say, did you think about this? Have you considered X, Y, and Z in this? Let's suppose you're a salesperson and they want to know how you're going about prospecting. And you say, well, I sit down with the phone directory every day and I go through it and I just start calling people. They don't print. They used to do this. They used to print these directories called phone directories. You all have never even seen one. And people had like landlines and their numbers were listed. And if you're doing that, your boss is probably going to say, you're an idiot and I'm going to fire you, because that's not the way we should go about prospecting in today's world. Just, sitting down with a phone book and making random phone calls. Although I'm convinced that's what they do with the extended warranty. How many of you received multiple calls? The do not call list has been destroyed somehow, and they call you continuously with, your car warranty is about to expire. Well, businesses that operate, above the level of sophistication of a neighborhood garage sale, if you tell your boss, I'm just randomly dialing numbers, talked to 100 people yesterday, that's probably not the prospecting that they want, right? So let's make it applicable to you as students. Let's suppose you do this article review and you plagiarize. I've actually had a student do this. They just basically copied and pasted the article into the review and turned it in. It's really easy to tell whether or not you do that anymore. You just copy and paste it into Google, or you run it through turnitin.com, or, like any of these things, it's pretty easy to find. So what are the consequences if I accuse you of plagiarism? What ultimately could happen? You could get suspended, or you could get expelled for academic misconduct. Now, let's suppose I accuse you of this. What are you going to want? Okay, so you're gonna want proof. What kind of proof are you gonna want? So you're gonna want me to have to say, I just can't accuse you of this, right? And throw you out. So you're gonna want some kind of proof. How are you gonna want that proof presented?
In writing?
Hard copy,
You what?
like a hard copy of like whatever the
Okay,
other.
so you want some kind of evidence. Right, this is kind of easy because I have the paper, and in an age in which we can check things so quickly by, just Googling it or turning it, running through Turnitin.com. That's not all that difficult to come up with. So you come to me and you say, I don't think that that's fair. I don't think I plagiarized. I sat on a committee once that heard a plagiarism case where the student had plagiarized the professor's dissertation. And her defense was, Jesus told me it was okay. I really, I really wish Jesus would come and talk to me like this. I've had several of these where I'm like, I went to Catholic school growing up, and the nuns used to tell us that we should talk to God every day, but that if God talked back, we should see them because there were drugs that they could give us that would help for the voices in your head, right? So, I've had several of these. I had a student, I used to have, when I taught American National Government, I used to have an assignment called My American Dream. And I'd have students write these papers about what their American dream was. And the reason I had them write these papers is because the American dream's shifting, right? There is this idea, we're the only country who does this, by the way. I was an exchange student in Germany, and nobody wandered around Germany saying, my German dream is, that's antithetical to their culture. But it's very much a part of our culture to say and what is the American dream? Well, historically, the American dream was, I want to, get a job and get married and buy a house and have 2 children and, the picket fence and the cats and dogs in the yard and, buy, 2 cars. That was the sort of stereotypical American dream. That has changed. People are now saying, that's not my dream. That's not what I want. I want to, rolling through again. I want to, be single and have no kids and make a lot of money. That's okay. So one of these students, I tell you this because one of the students that wrote the My American Dream paper, I can tell you this because I'm not telling you the student's name, wrote that Jesus told them to come to UCO. Like, how? Like, you were in bed and Jesus waltzed in, sat down at the end of the bed and said, hey, I think you should go to, I wish Jesus would talk to me this because it would make my life much simpler, right? If this would occur, right? But Jesus told the student to plagiarize the dissertation. Having a hard time buying that defense, I will tell you. But so student plagiarizes professor's dissertation, says Jesus told them to do it. Should the professor be the end all and be all of that? No, I don't believe you. I don't think Jesus talked to you. You're out of school. Should we be able to do that? You're gone. See ya. Bye.
Yeah, I would say yeah.
No, that's not the way it works.
Well,
I can't do that. I'm gonna tell you,
Whenever you roll, you basically consent that if you
Yeah.
plagiarize, you're
Plagiarize,
out, it doesn't
right.
matter if Jesus told you.
yeah, but should I be the one, if you do this, should I be the one that says you're out?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay, so we might want some impartial
Somebody that is, I guess,
person.
neutral.
Right, neutral, impartial, to hear us. We don't want the professor. if you plagiarize my dissertation, I'm probably gonna be pretty upset. Although maybe I'll just be flattered because imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, right? So maybe I should just be flattered rather than upset, but no, probably not gonna just let me be the one to do this. So we want something that's impartial. So we want some kind of proof. We want some evidence. We want some impartiality. What does all this sort of lead to? Well, it means that we want some kind of hearing, all right? But before we get to a hearing, you know, we want to have something else. We don't want to just be able to say, for example, I shouldn't just be able to say, you've committed a great academic crime and we're going to throw you out. Right? You're going to want to know what that crime is. So we're going to want some kind of, before we get to a hearing, we're going to want some kind of notice. And this is what we call the heart of procedural due process. Notice and hearing. Notice and hearing. Now, the more egregious the offense and the more draconian the punishment can be, the more hearing we're going to want, right? So let's suppose you plagiarize my dissertation, and God help you if you do, because it's really boring. I mean, it involves ethics and marketing and students. What could be more boring than that, right? God help you if you do that. But let's suppose you plagiarize my dissertation. Well, I have an academic integrity statement in my syllabus, and it says, you know, if you do any of these things, I can give you an F. Now that's something I can do on my own. And an F is bad. But it's not throw you out of college forever, right? You can overcome an F. So you're going to want to talk to me and say, what did I do? And I'm going to say, well, you plagiarized my dissertation. Like, here's, you know, page 35 of the dissertation. And by God, you like have big, you know, chunks of page 35 in your article review. Yeah.
What happens when it comes to like citations or like using it as a source?
Okay. I think what you're saying is that's an affirmative defense, right?
Right.
So like I accuse you of plagiarizing my dissertation and maybe you have an affirmative defense, which is, look, professor, yep, I sure did. I copied 3 paragraphs, but guess what? There's quotation marks around that, right? And there's a thing at the end of those quotation marks in parentheses that says Aguirre 2005, you know, and however, I mean, there are different styles, right? I grew up, when I came out of college, we still footnoted everything. So you'd put a footnote and then have a bibliography at the end, you know, but like we've gotten much looser, in my opinion, with this. And we now have what's called parenthetical citation, which is either the MLA or the APA. By the way, marketing has their own sort of parenthetical for most of our journals citation style. It's called the Journal of Marketing style that they use, which is slightly different. But like you say, look, yeah, I sure did. There's 3 whole paragraphs right there, but there's these quotation marks around it. And at the end, there's these parentheses. I don't have COVID. It's called allergies. The stupid Bradford pears, which are horrible trees. I'm allergic to them. They bulb and bloom and several other things. They're like, they should never, those trees should be banned. They smell plant them. Oh, they do. You go up to them, they're like this nice white puffy ball. They look like a snowball.
The smell is
And they smell like death. Which, by the way, apparently at the Myriad Crystal Bridge, they have a death plant that's in full bloom, and you can go like, I don't know why you want to do this. Yeah, I think it finished blooming
every
yesterday.
5 or 7 years. and it blooms.
Every 9
Oh,
years.
9.
Every 9 years, yeah.
24 hours.
Yeah. So one of my friends was actually down there and took pictures. I don't know why you'd want to go smell some plant that smells like death, but the Bradford pears smell just about as bad. So you know, that's an affirmative, you want some, so I accuse you of plagiarism, you want some hearing. So if I'm just gonna give you an F, maybe that's the end of it. Maybe that's, you know, like, okay, I've accused you, you've talked to me, and I still say, no, sorry, you know, you left the parentheses off 3 lines. That's enough to give you, you know, it's, you didn't do it correctly. That's an F. That doesn't seem like, I'm not impacting the rest of your life. Whereas if I say I'm gonna turn you into the student conduct officer and we're gonna throw you off campus, now all of a sudden, this is impacting more of your life. So you have this idea of an affirmative defense than just getting an F. You can overcome an F. How can you overcome an F? Well, you can work really hard in all of your other classes. You have to have this class, by the way, to get a marketing degree, but you can retake the class and replace the grade. We let you do that. If you get an F in a class, you can retake it, and it will not affect your total GPA, but it will raise your retentive GPA, which is the GPA that counts for things like graduation. So there's a way, right? So it's notice and hearing. How much notice and hearing do you want? And this is a big issue. In a private enterprise, how much in free market where you have property rights and efficiency of management, how much notice and hearing do you want? Well, I would suggest that those companies that engage in higher levels of notice and hearing and engage in procedural due process actually have employees that are more loyal to the company. And so it's something that we should consider. But the heart of due process is notice and hearing. How much notice and how much hearing do you need? Well, that sort of depends. In a state institution like UCO, if we're really gonna do something bad, like throw you out, which is a permanent notation on your transcript, which means that if you go to another school, they're gonna see this and that can impact your ability to get a degree even there, we're gonna have to give you a lot more notice and hearing. What does that mean? Well, it means that we're gonna have to provide you under our policies with so many days. Then we have to set up a hearing in front of the student conduct officer. And if you don't like that, then you have an appeal to the academic appeals board, right? Where they can determine whether or not you should be thrown out. And who is that comprised of? It's not comprised of the professor that filed the charge. It's made up of professors and students who we think are, you know, going to be fair and impartial, that have nothing to do with the case, that don't know you. And in theory, they may know the professor because it's hard in a small community like this to not know, but can they render judgment, you know, in somewhat of an equitable manner? Yes. So this is the heart of it. How much of a hearing do we have to have? The more we're taking away from you, the more that hearing should resemble a full trial, right? If I accuse you, murder is defined as this is what we call a factor or an elements test as opposed to a factors test. Murder is, you have to meet every element of the test in order to be convicted of murder, right? So murder is defined at the common law, which nobody uses anymore, as the unlawful to killing 3 human being for malice aforethought. You have to meet every element of the test as opposed to a factors test, so it has to be unlawful. What's an unlawful killing? Well, if I just decide to shoot you, that's unlawful. A justified killing is one, you know, self-defense is justified. That's not unlawful. Unlawful killing, human being, malice aforethought. I accuse you of that as the state. We have to have a whole trial, which involves a judge who is impartial, a jury selected of your peers who know nothing about the case and is impartial, right? You have the right to have an attorney. You have a right to call witnesses on your own behalf and to cross-examine those witnesses. That's what a full trial represents. The more we're draconian in the punishment, the more of this hearing you should get. If it's not, if it just involves, like a written reprimand in your employment or something like that, what should you get? Well, generally, it's like you meet with a supervisor and the person from HR, and you sort of lay out your case. You may not have the ability to call witnesses and things like that, but you have the right to present my side of the story. The supervisor presents their side of the story, and then HR says, yeah, maybe we should go ahead and let this stay in your personnel file, or makes a recommendation that it shouldn't, right? If they're gonna fire you, maybe you should get more like like I can call, John and Sue, who are my coworkers, who will say, I followed instructions. I was there the day that he told me to do X, Y, and Z, and I did X, Y, and Z, and he's now saying I didn't do X, Y, and Z, right? So the more it's draconian, the more you should have like formal trial. In the private sector, they don't have to give you this. But what I would argue as an ethicist is that if you do this, you ensure better results and you ensure higher degrees of loyalty among your employees. If employees feel like they are treated fairly, and other employees feel like, if they just come in and say, here's your box, get out, that doesn't seem to be very fair. And it degrades the ability of you to try and encourage employees to live the brand. Participation rights in the workforce. So aside from if these draconian, what other rights should we have? Well, what about workplace democracy? Should employees be able to say things like, I think we would be better if we do this? Managers will say, historically, management would say, nope, we know best, we're management. But, these are the people that are actually doing it. One of the things that you find is the further you get away from having done the job yourself, the less you know about it. I used to be an administrator here at UCO. I worked in the Office of the Legal Counsel. I was an attorney in the Office of the Legal Counsel here. I can tell you my understanding of what I was a college professor at the same time, by the way. So I had a pretty good understanding. But lots of my colleagues who have never been in a classroom have no idea, or who have not been in a classroom in 20 years have no idea. It's not the same, folks. Our last president, he had been a college professor. The one before that, not so much. The current one, not so much. But the last president we had, Don Batts, he started out as a college professor. But he hadn't been in a classroom, really in a classroom, in probably 30 years, 30 or 40 years. It's not the same. We're not using chalkboards and slide rules, Dawn. There's this thing called PowerPoint, which I actually hate. I'd like to go back to the chalkboards. I liked the chalkboards, right? You could read my handwriting if I wrote on a chalkboard. You can't read my handwriting now because these things are slick. They just go all over. But should we, should we be able to say, that's not the way it works? I had a professor who, he was one of my professors, and when I became a professor, he said, this is my advice, Grant. You can tell a good class from a bad class in the first 15 seconds of a class. And I said, Dr. Jones, how can you do that? That's like, if I could tell, this is amazing. And he said, you walk in the morning and you say, good morning, class. And if it's a bad class, they'll respond with, good morning, Dr. Aguirre. If it's a good class, there will be silence and they will have written it down. I haven't had one of those classes. I've been here, I've been teaching, this is my 28th year. Haven't had a class like that in, the last 20 and 28 years, right? And that's just not the way students operate anymore. And so, you know, things change. So should I be able to say things like, you know, this is not working? You know, providing me with a overhead projector and some transparencies is not gonna work anymore. Maybe. Why should we have workplace democracy? Well, it creates conditions of self-respect. In workplaces where they ask employees, what do you think? What is going on? You may have seen this show. It's become popular on one of those shows, and now it's lost in its popularity, but it became enormously popular, called Undercover Boss, where the bosses went and they figured out what employees were actually doing, like saying, and things like that, you know, can lead to better improvement. It can decrease alienation and burnout. If you understand what it is that the mission is and how you fit into that mission, and you have some participation in that mission, it will ultimately, I would argue, be beneficial to the company as a whole. Creates greater social participation. The arguments against workplace democracy generally are I think fairly antiquated. The idea of property rights. It's my business. I have the right to say what happens. It's my property. Well, yep, that's true, but should you? Managerial expertise, the idea that I know best, I'm the manager, I know what is best. Well, that may be true, but maybe it's not. Again, I have a friend who works for the Weather Service in Norman. His boss in IT, she's an engineer, doesn't really know anything about IT. You know, managerial expertise only goes so far. The biggest one is probably efficiency. Democracy is inefficient. It's not efficient. The most efficient form of government, by analogy, if we take this to a national state level, is a dictatorship. Dictators are horribly efficient. I say this is the law, and if you break the law, I kill you. Very efficient. Right? Trial inefficient. Due process inefficient. But there's a difference between most preferred and highly efficient. Just because something's efficient doesn't mean it's effective. It may, but it doesn't. Efficiency doesn't necessarily mean effectiveness. I can be highly efficient, and not very effective. I would suggest to you that if I had the right to, summarily execute students who fall asleep in my class, that would be really efficient. There may not be anybody sleeping, but it may create such paranoia that you're not learning anything either, right? As you sit there on the edge of your seat. Employee health and safety, this is largely regulated by the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970. Degrees of health and safety, this becomes an issue. How much should we engage? How, the carpal tunnel rules that were overruled by George W. Bush after the Clinton administration had implemented them. It also involves issues of autonomy and workers, rights to control their own bodies. And those obviously have great moral import. Privacy in the workplace. This is becoming more and more of an issue in an era of computers. When I first started teaching ethics many, many years ago, and when I first started teaching ethics in business, they estimated that the average American at that time, this was in the mid-1990s, the average American at that time was photographed 50 times a day without them even noticing it, without them being cognizant of it. Some of the most important and damning evidence against Timothy McVeigh in the Oklahoma City bombing was a surveillance video camera in the apartment building across the street from the Murrah building where you could clearly see him getting out of the Ryder pickup and walking away. I mean, they caught it on video. You are now photographed thousands of times a day without even knowing it, probably. Every time you walk past an ATM. We have cameras on all of the buildings. They started out just having cameras on Bronco Lake so that we could figure out whether or not you were swimming. I don't know why you didn't want to swim in the lake. There are cameras in Walmart parking lots, in the convenience store. How many cameras does Walmart have? I mean, like every single one of those black bubbles above you is a camera photographing you. I mean, you're photographed constantly. What should we expect in terms of privacy? Online, everything is tracked. Your employer can track everything. They can track every website you go and visit. They can install software that allows them to track every keystroke that you make. How much is too much? At which point do we start saying, oh, that's a little creepy. That's a little Orwellian. So we have to balance all of these ideas. And it's a balancing between the legal, the contractual, and the moral, right? We should consider employee rights. For every right, we should have responsibilities. And I'm going to try and get through some of these, and we'll finish the rest next Tuesday and move on to the next chapter as well. So responsibilities. I've already talked about Enron. What are the rights that we owe to others and our employees? What are the responsibilities that we owe to others? Well, there's a narrow view of these. The narrow view is what we call the principal agent view of employment. This is a very narrow legal view. As an agent of the organization, I owe them a responsibility of loyalty, obedience, and thrift. Now, this one, from a moral standpoint, has become highly controversial, the loyalty responsibility. Historically, under this agent principle, you had a duty of loyalty. Now that becomes controversial because the principals no longer have duties of loyalty to you. So why should you have a duty of loyalty to them? But do you still have a duty of obedience? What does this mean? I'm going to do what you tell me to do. And I'm not going to waste anything in doing that. That's the duty of thrift. I'm not going to waste stuff. As a professor, what does that mean? Well, for example, one of the things, they tell me this is the class you're going to teach. And I teach it. And I have a duty to not waste. So one of the things I've stopped doing, and maybe I should restart doing it, because students oftentimes ask me questions, and like the biggest number of questions I have anymore, literally, I respond with, that's in the syllabus. Like, it's in the syllabus. Like, what's my grade? The formula is in the syllabus, right? Like, it's a point system in here, total points. So you take the total points you have and you divide by the total points possible. And then if you want to move the decimal point over, you multiply it by 100. Pretty easy. I think that's the way. I know in my IMC class, it's a weighted average. I understand that's a little more complicated, but I still think that like business students should be able to figure a weighted average. Maybe, right? Like literally, it's in the syllabus. So one of the things I've stopped doing as part of my duty of thrift is once we got D2L and everybody was using D2L, I stopped printing out syllabi and bringing them into class. Why? Because that's wasteful. It costs money. The university has to pay for this huge printing machine down the hall. It's now on D2L. You can look at it every day. You can pull it up. If you lost the paper, I'm not having to give you another one. right? So that's part of the duty of thrift. The duty of loyalty. If companies are not gonna be loyal to you, my grandmother worked until she retired for the Sandia Corporation. You know how she got her job? She was the classified records librarian for Sandia National Labs. She had been a teacher, but when she was a teacher in Kentucky, at the time she was a teacher, when you got married, you could no longer be a teacher because you were no longer chaste. So that meant that you were no longer pure, right? Like, so you couldn't be a teacher, so you had to retire when you got married. And so she taught in a one-room schoolhouse. She gets married, can't be a teacher anymore. My grandfather works on the Manhattan Project. He was at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and then they went to California, and then they ultimately moved to Albuquerque, where Sandia National Labs is, and that was part of the Manhattan Project. My grandfather was at all of the above ground testing of the bomb, the first bomb that was dropped, which is at the Trinity site, which is out at Stallions Gate in White Sands, New Mexico, at the White Sands Missile Range, Stallions Gate, and they dropped the bomb, right? So my grandfather was there. When he died of a heart attack at 38, the president of the company came to my grandmother and said, "We have a job for you. Your husband was loyal to us, we're loyal to you." They made her the classified records librarian. My grandmother classified all of the nuclear secrets that Sandia Labs produced. That's what she did. She would classify them, read them, and then take them out to these vaults in the Monsanto Mountains. They had these huge, big vaults in the mountains, and she would store them out there. That was their repository for these nuclear secrets. That's loyalty. Companies don't do that anymore. They don't go to the widow and say, "We're going to give you a job," right? They just don't. That's sort of foreign and alien. So this becomes morally problematic in many senses, but can we replace it with something else? I still think you have obedience and thrift. I still think, you shouldn't waste, and you should still, I should show up for class when they tell me to show up for class. If I'm not showing up for class, I'm not fulfilling my job, right? Professional ethics. The learned professions generally have codes of their own that we have to consider. So I'm an attorney, and the legal profession has a very long code of ethics. The rules of professional conduct that, govern. So those are things that we have to consider, and more professions are engaging in those. So I am out of time, so I will take a picture. If you got ducks, come up, and if you want to tell me that you showed up for the sales thing, I will also add those points in. But so that I don't get confused, I need you to also put your name here for sales. So I want your name, time. Do that.
No, I don't mind. No. I would say.
Stop.
Yeah,
the
just
live
go
stream.
through the introduction class, but I have.
Sorry, you don't want me doing it.
Yeah, I had to do it.
It's not